A slap echoed through the gas station, shattering the mundane routine of a regular Tuesday afternoon. The confrontation between a white woman and a black man would soon become viral footage that sparked heated debates across social media platforms. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The heat in Cedar Hill that afternoon was relentless, pressing down on the small Texas town like a heavy blanket. Robert Johnson wiped beads of sweat from his brow as he stood beside his weathered sedan at pump number 3. The metallic clang of the gas cap hitting the pavement echoed across the nearly empty station lot, momentarily drowning out the cicada's persistent drone. Robert, a history teacher at the local high school, was beloved by students and faculty alike for his gentle smile and patient demeanor. As he watched the numbers climb on the pump display, his mind drifted to the lunch waiting at his sister's house. Angela's famous chicken and dumplings, the recipe passed down through generations of Johnsons. The thought alone made his empty stomach growl in anticipation. He barely registered the sound of hurried footsteps approaching until they were nearly upon him. Jennifer Davis, daughter of Commissioner David Davis, stormed across the concrete, her face contorted with an emotion that seemed to radiate from her in waves. Her designer handbag swung wildly from her arm as she moved, eyes fixed on Robert with an intensity that might have warned him had he noticed sooner. "Excuse me," Robert began politely, thinking perhaps she needed access to the pump. What happened next occurred so quickly that the few witnesses present would later give conflicting accounts. Jennifer's hand flew through the air, connecting with Robert's cheek with a crack that seemed to silence everything else in the vicinity. The slap was delivered with such force that Robert's head jerked sideways, his glasses askew. Time seemed to suspend itself in that moment. The history teacher blinked twice, his hand rising slowly to touch the reddening mark on his face. Disbelief washed over him, followed by a flash of something rarely seen in his typically calm demeanor: indignation. In one fluid, measured motion, Robert Johnson did something that would change the trajectory of countless lives in Cedar Hill. He returned the slap, not with rage or excessive force, but with the same precise intensity with which he had received it. Jennifer stumbled backward, mouth agape, clearly stunned that the man had dared to respond in kind. Her shock quickly morphed into outrage as she glanced around, suddenly aware of their audience. Neither of them noticed the small security camera mounted above the station's entrance, its unblinking eye capturing every second of the encounter in perfect, silent detail. The footage showing both the unprovoked attack and Robert's response would soon travel far beyond the borders of their small Texas town, igniting a firestorm that neither could have anticipated in that scorching moment at the gas station. Within 24 hours, the surveillance footage from the gas station spread like wildfire across social media. The video, grainy but unmistakable, showed the moment Jennifer Davis struck Robert Johnson and his measured response. Cedar Hill residents watched in stunned silence as their peaceful town became the epicenter of a national conversation about respect, race, and reaction. At Cedar Hill Baptist Church, where Robert had led the choir through Christmas carols just months earlier, Pastor William Harris faced a congregation divided. Some members shifted uncomfortably in the pews, while others spoke passionately in Robert's defense. "I've known Robert Johnson for 15 years, declared Deacon Thomas after Sunday service. "That man taught my children history and dignity. If anyone deserves our support, it's him." The church choir, still loyal to their former director, organized an impromptu gathering on the church steps. Their harmonies carried across the magnolia-lined streets as they sang hymns of perseverance and justice, a musical statement of solidarity that drew both tears and uncomfortable glances from passers-by. Meanwhile, at the local diner, Mary Thompson poured coffee with extra care, listening to the heated debates erupting at her counters. The establishment, usually filled with friendly chatter about weather and local sports, now buzzed with tension as residents chose sides. "Did you see how she just attacked him?" whispered a retired school teacher to her companion. "And they're trying to make him the villain?" Across the room, a man in a business suit muttered to his colleagues, "There's always more to these stories than what you see in a 10-second clip." By Tuesday morning, flyers appeared throughout the diner, taped to windows, slipped between sugar packets, and stacked near the register. Bold letters demanded justice for Robert above a QR code linking to the unedited footage. Mary neither removed nor endorsed them, understanding that her establishment had become neutral ground in an increasingly divided town. At the school where Robert taught, students whispered in hallways while teachers maintained uncomfortable silence. Principal Wilson issued a carefully worded statement about reserving judgment until all facts emerge, which satisfied no one. Sarah Martinez watched it all unfold from behind the counter at the gas station, her college textbooks momentarily forgotten. She noticed how customers now avoided eye contact with her, as though the establishment itself were tainted. When her manager instructed her to direct all media inquiries to the corporate office, she nodded obediently while quietly taking mental notes of everything she observed. By week's end, Cedar Hills residents found themselves taking inventory of friendships and allegiances, wondering which relationships might survive the aftershocks of those few seconds captured on camera. As the days passed, Cedar Hills' facade of tranquility began to crack. Robert Johnson sat at his kitchen table staring at his phone where a text from Sarah Martinez glowed ominously. "You need to hear this." The audio recordings had come from an anonymous source, hushed conversations between Frank Wilson, the gas station manager, and a man whose voice matched Thomas Davis, Jennifer's uncle and the commissioner's brother. Their words were unmistakable. "We need that footage edited before it gets to the police. The angle makes it look worse than it was." Sarah had discovered the recordings while organizing files at the gas station. "I wasn't snooping," she explained to Robert, her voice trembling. The manager left his computer unlocked, and the audio file was right there, labeled Davis Situation. The evidence of tampering didn't stop there. When Angela Johnson visited Town Hall to file a formal complaint, she noticed a yellow note pinned to the community bulletin board. "Remember, Cedar Hills' peace depends on forgetting what needs forgetting." No signature, just a small drawing of a gas pump in the corner. By Wednesday, more peculiarities emerged. The security tape from the adjacent convenience store, which would have captured the incident from a different angle, had vanished. The store owner merely shrugged when questioned, claiming a technical malfunction had occurred that specific day. At the weekly council meeting, Commissioner David Davis avoided eye contact with anyone who mentioned the incident. When Pastor William Harris politely inquired about the investigation's status, the commissioner's fingers drummed nervously against the mahogany table. "We're following proper protocols," he responded curtly, his voice carrying none of its usual authority. Michael Brown, the prosecutor, sat silently in the back row, his legal pad conspicuously blank. When Robert approached him after the meeting, the lawyer's eyes darted around the room. "I want to help," he whispered, "but there are complications. People are making calls. Important people." The following day, 3 separate witnesses who had been at the gas station reported receiving identical text messages. "Cedar Hill takes care of its own. Don't get involved." Each message came from different untraceable numbers. Meanwhile, Jennifer Davis had disappeared from public view. Her social media accounts went silent, and her usual table at Mary Thompson's diner remained empty. Rumors spread that she'd been sent to stay with relatives in Houston until things blew over. For a town known for its friendly smiles and neighborly waves, Cedar Hill now felt like a place of shadows and whispers. Beneath its picturesque surface of magnolia trees and white picket fences, currents of secrecy and collusion swirled, threatening to pull everyone under. With the video now spreading across social media, Jennifer Davis found herself at the center of a firestorm. The once influential Davis family name offered little protection against the public's harsh judgment. Desperate to salvage her reputation, Jennifer scheduled a press conference at the Cedar Hill Town Hall. "I was experiencing a severe panic attack," she claimed, her voice quavering as cameras flashed. Post-trauma triggered an involuntary response. Tears streamed down her face as she described alleged childhood incidents that had left her with anxiety and PTSD. Her attorney, standing protectively at her side, elaborated on her misunderstood intentions and demanded privacy during this difficult healing process. Local news outlets initially treated her claims with cautious sympathy. The Cedar Hill Gazette ran a front-page story questioning whether the community had rushed to judgment. For a moment, public opinion seemed to waver, but Sarah Martinez couldn't stay silent. The young college student had been working behind the counter at the gas station that fateful day. Though her supervisor warned her to stay out of it, Sarah's conscience wouldn't allow it. "What happened that day wasn't random," she told Robert Johnson during a quiet meeting at the local diner. "I've seen similar incidents before." With trembling hands, Sarah showed him her smartphone. She had taken screenshots of the station's complaint system before certain records mysteriously disappeared, the day after the incident. 3 separate complaints about Jennifer confronting black customers over the past year, she explained. All of them vanished from our system overnight. The college student's revelation transformed the narrative. This wasn't an isolated incident or panic attack. It was part of a pattern that someone had deliberately tried to conceal. When Sarah attempted to access the physical copies of these complaints, she discovered they too had disappeared from the filing cabinet. The manager claimed they must have been misplaced during routine cleaning, but his averted gaze told a different story. Robert sat stunned, processing what this meant. "Who else knows about this?" he asked quietly. "No one who's willing to speak up," Sarah replied. "Most employees here need their jobs too badly to risk it." Despite her own precarious position, tuition payments looming and rent due, Sarah decided to testify about the missing records. Her bravery inspired others to question the Davis family's influence over local businesses. As Jennifer's carefully constructed narrative began crumbling, her attorney stopped returning media calls. The town's whispers grew louder, and people began wondering what other truths might be hiding beneath Cedar Hill's peaceful surface. Sarah Martinez's testimony opened a floodgate of revelations that Cedar Hill's residents had kept bottled up for generations. What began as one brave college student speaking up transformed into dozens of community members coming forward with similar stories. File cabinets that should have contained years of formal complaints were mysteriously empty. Statements about discriminatory treatment had been misplaced or never received according to official records. "It's like they wanted us to believe we were imagining things," Sarah explained to a packed town hall meeting. Her voice trembled, but her resolve remained steady as she presented her findings. The young gas station employee had meticulously documented each missing report, creating a timeline that painted a disturbing pattern of institutional neglect. Robert Johnson sat quietly in the back row, his gentle smile replaced by a look of grim vindication. The history teacher had suspected for years that Cedar Hill harbored deeper problems beneath its friendly facade. Now the evidence was undeniable. One elderly resident, tears streaming down her weathered face, recounted how her son's harassment complaint from 15 years earlier had vanished without investigation. "They told us to move on, to forget about it," she said. "But how do you forget when the same thing keeps happening over and over?" Meanwhile, across town in a dimly lit office, Michael Brown stared at his phone, reading the latest anonymous message with growing unease. "Drop the Johnson case if you know what's good for you." Problems like this have a way of disappearing in Cedar Hill. The local prosecutor ran his hands through his hair, the weight of the decision before him feeling heavier by the minute. He'd entered law to pursue justice, but the reality of small-town politics had slowly eroded his idealism. The Brown family name carried respect in Cedar Hill, but even that wouldn't shield him if he challenged the established order. His wife had already noticed the unmarked vehicle that occasionally parked across from their home. "I can't just look the other way," he confessed to his empty office. "But at what cost?" The prosecutor pulled out the case file, reviewing the gas station footage for the 100th time. The evidence was clear. Jennifer Davis had struck first, and Robert had responded in kind. Simple self-defense by any reasonable standard. Yet nothing was simple in Cedar Hill when it involved the Davis family. Commissioner David Davis had already called twice, his tone friendly but the implied threats unmistakable. Michael knew the system was designed to protect people like the Davises, not expose them. As darkness fell over the town, 2 paths lay before him: career security or moral courage. The choice would define not just the case, but the man he would become. Cedar Hill transformed as autumn settled in, painting the magnolia-lined streets with hues of amber and gold. The beauty of the season stood in stark contrast to Robert Johnson's intensifying struggle. The history teacher found himself caught in a web of bureaucratic obstruction that seemed to tighten with each passing day. His attorney's repeated requests for the complete surveillance footage were met with increasingly absurd roadblocks. Town officials claimed that water meters near the gas station had been mysteriously vandalized, potentially affecting the electrical systems that powered the security cameras. Technical reports suddenly appeared, labeling the critical files as corrupted beyond recovery. Deadlines for evidence submission slipped by without progress, each extension accompanied by apologetic smiles and empty promises. "We're doing everything we can," insisted a clerk at the courthouse, avoiding Robert's eyes while shuffling papers on her desk. Despite these setbacks, the teacher's quiet strength never wavered. His patience, honesty, and relentless courage became a beacon for supporters who gathered weekly outside the town hall. Students from his history classes created hand-painted signs quoting civil rights leaders, their young faces serious with purpose as they stood beside their mentor. At home, Robert's reality was far more vulnerable. Late at night, when the house fell silent and the weight of his ordeal pressed heaviest, he would sit at his kitchen table rereading letters from family members scattered across the country. His cousin in Detroit urged him to consider moving north. An aunt in Atlanta reminded him that their grandfather had faced similar injustice with dignity. Angela, his sister, wrote daily, her handwriting growing more urgent as threats against her brother intensified. "Please stay safe," she wrote. "This town isn't worth your life." Robert traced these words with his fingertip, torn between protecting his privacy and fighting for the truth. The thought of retreating felt like surrender, yet the strain was taking its toll. Dark circles framed his eyes, and colleagues noticed his once robust laugh had grown quieter, more reserved. One evening, as he graded papers by lamplight, Michael Brown, the local prosecutor, appeared at his door unannounced. "I shouldn't be here," the prosecutor said, glancing nervously at the street. "But you need to know they're deliberately stalling. The footage exists, unaltered. I've seen." Before Robert could respond, Michael hurried back to his vehicle, leaving the teacher standing in the doorway, holding a half-graded essay as autumn leaves swirled around his feet. Pastor William Harris clutched the podium at Cedar Hill Baptist Church, his weathered hands trembling slightly as sunlight streamed through stained glass windows. For 43 years, he had served this congregation faithfully, but never had he faced such a moral crossroad. The anonymous letter that arrived at his home 3 days earlier still burned in his mind. "A man of God knows when to counsel peace and acceptance. Your church's involvement in this unfortunate incident must end." The pastor had spent sleepless nights praying for guidance. This morning, he'd finally found clarity. "My brothers and sisters," William began, his voice stronger than he felt, "I must confess something troubling." The congregation fell silent. "I've been pressured to silence our support for Robert Johnson." Gasps rippled through the pews. Robert, sitting beside his sister Angela in the third row, straightened his posture, his expression a careful mask. "For weeks I've received messages suggesting our church should focus on spiritual matters and avoid divisive issues," the pastor continued. "But I ask you, what could be more spiritual than standing for truth? What could be more Christ-like than defending the dignity of our neighbor?" The sanctuary, usually a place of harmony, quickly transformed into a battleground of whispers. Deacon Phillips, a longtime friend of Commissioner Davis, stood abruptly and walked out, followed by his wife and 2 other families. Mrs. Henderson, who had taught Sunday school for 20 years, crossed her arms tightly across her chest, her disapproval evident. Yet for every person who showed discomfort, others nodded in agreement. Sarah Martinez, filming discreetly from the back row, captured the moment when Angela Johnson reached for her brother's hand, squeezing it in solidarity. "This community cannot heal through silence," Pastor William declared, his voice gaining strength. "Cedar Hill must confront its sins before seeking redemption." After the service, the fellowship hall became a microcosm of the town's division. Longtime friends avoided eye contact. Hushed arguments broke out near the coffee urns. Robert found himself surrounded by supporters, while across the room, a group huddled in obvious dissent. That evening, 3 church board members called for an emergency meeting to discuss the pastor's inappropriate political stance. Meanwhile, William returned home to find his church office keys no longer worked. The locks had been changed without notice. The price of solidarity was becoming painfully clear, but something fundamental had shifted in Cedar Hill. The conspiracy of silence that had protected the powerful for generations was beginning to crumble, one brave voice at a time. Angela Johnson had spent weeks watching her brother endure public scrutiny, while town officials dragged their feet. The quiet dignity Robert maintained only strengthened her resolve. One evening, after finding him slumped at his kitchen table reviewing yet another dismissive email from the school administration, Angela decided enough was enough. "They think they can wait us out," she said, squeezing her brother's shoulder. "But they don't know who they're dealing with. The next morning, Angela launched a petition demanding transparency from the Cedar Hill School Board. She stationed herself outside the local grocery store, approaching shoppers with a clipboard and determination burning in her eyes. By sunset, she had collected over 200 signatures. "People are ready for change," she told Robert over dinner. They just needed someone to take the first step. What began as a simple petition quickly evolved into a movement. Angela organized community meetings at the diner where Mary Thompson worked, gathering testimonies from residents who had experienced similar injustices. The stories followed a disturbing pattern: complaints mysteriously vanishing, concerns dismissed, and the same powerful families always emerging unscathed. "The Davises aren't just protecting Jennifer," whispered an elderly teacher who had retired years earlier. "They've been pulling strings in this town for decades." Angela's persistence paid off when a junior administrator from the district office contacted her anonymously. The young woman provided digital copies of emails showing how officials had systematically buried reports against certain families. One particularly damning message instructed staff to handle the Johnson situation with special care and minimize potential exposure. When Angela presented this evidence at a packed school board meeting, the atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. Board members exchanged nervous glances as she methodically connected the dots between past cover-ups and her brother's current situation. "This isn't just about Robert," Angela declared, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "It's about every person in Cedar Hill who believed their voice mattered, only to discover some voices count more than others." The board chairman attempted to adjourn the meeting early, but the crowd refused to disperse. Under mounting pressure, 2 district officials finally admitted that complaints had indeed been filtered based on the subject's social standing or family connections. As news of these admissions spread through Cedar Hill, longtime residents began questioning other town decisions. The foundation of trust that had held their community together for generations began to crack and crumble. At the heart of this awakening stood Angela Johnson, not seeking the spotlight, but refusing to step back into the shadows. The first snow of winter dusted Cedar Hill, transforming the town into a postcard image that belied the turmoil beneath. At the community center, Angela Johnson sat stunned, holding a yellow document that had been anonymously slipped under the door. Her hands trembled as she read the heading, "Protocol for Community Complaint Management." "Robert, need to see this," she whispered to her brother. The memo, dated 3 years prior and bearing Commissioner David Davis's flowing signature, outlined explicit instructions to filter out problematic complaints from certain demographics and prioritize concerns from established families. The document even specified which neighborhoods deserved expedited attention, all affluent areas where the Davis family held property investments. "This proves everything," Robert Johnson said, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "It's not just about what happened to me, it's systematic." When Sarah Martinez arrived later that afternoon, she photographed the memo with her smartphone, carefully documenting each damning paragraph. The young college student had transformed in recent months, her quiet demeanor replaced by determined purpose. What had begun as a part-time job at the gas station had evolved into something more meaningful. She was now capturing Cedar Hill's awakening through her camera lens. "I've been interviewing people," Sarah explained, setting up her equipment in the corner, "elders who've lived here their whole lives. They've been waiting decades for someone to listen." Her documentary project started simply, interviews with residents about the incident at the gas station. But as winter deepened, it evolved into something more profound. Miss Eleanor Wilson, 83 years old, recounted how her husband's application for a business loan had been repeatedly lost in the 1970s. Former city employee Thomas Green described how complaint forms from certain neighborhoods would mysteriously disappear from filing cabinets overnight. "It's like pulling on a thread," Sarah told Robert one evening as they reviewed footage. "The whole sweater is coming apart." The community responded to her work with a mixture of discomfort and recognition. At a small screening in the Baptist church basement, Pastor William Harris watched with tears in his eyes as decades of quiet discrimination were finally given voice. "We always knew," an elderly woman whispered during the viewing. "We just didn't have proof." The memo and Sarah's documentary became twin catalysts, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Commissioner Davis's office issued a terse statement, claiming the document was being taken out of context, but the damage was done. Cedar Hill's machine of silence and favoritism had been exposed, its gears and levers laid bare for all to see. As winter settled in, the truth was finally breaking through like persistent green shoots through frozen ground. As the first warm breezes of spring swept through Cedar Hill, Robert Johnson's case finally reached the courthouse. The small Texas town's justice system, typically a sleepy affair of traffic violations and minor disputes, now faced its most significant challenge in decades. Judge Eleanor Wilson, a woman known for her strict adherence to procedure, had been visibly moved by the growing public demonstrations outside her chambers. "The court will hear additional testimony," she announced, her voice echoing through the packed room. Her decision came after reviewing mounting evidence that could no longer be ignored: security footage that hadn't been tampered with, audio recordings that contradicted official statements, and most damning of all, witnesses willing to speak truth to power. Former gas station employees approached the stand one by one, their testimonies painting a disturbing pattern. "We were told to look the other way whenever certain families had complaints against them," admitted Thomas Green, who had worked at the establishment for 7 years. The Davis name was always at the top of that list. Michael Brown, the local prosecutor who had initially hesitated to pursue the case, now stood firm despite the personal cost. He had received 3 more anonymous threats the previous night, but something in Robert's quiet dignity had awakened his own courage. "Your Honor," Brown addressed the court, "what we're uncovering here goes beyond a single incident at a gas station. This is about systematic protection of certain citizens at the expense of others." The courtroom crackled with tension. Jennifer Davis sat rigid beside her high-priced attorney, her composure crumbling as each new witness undermined her carefully constructed narrative. Across the aisle, Robert maintained the same calm demeanor that had earned him respect among generations of history students. Sarah Martinez watched from the gallery, documenting each moment with careful notes. The young college student had transformed from a nervous witness to a determined chronicler of Cedar Hill's reckoning. Beside her sat Angela Johnson, whose unwavering support for her brother had inspired many in the community to find their own voices. As the afternoon wore on, prosecutors and defense attorneys traded increasingly hostile objections. The Davis family lawyer, a man accustomed to controlling the narrative, found himself outmaneuvered at every turn. His frustration manifested in tightly clenched fists and barely concealed scowls. "The truth doesn't stay buried forever," whispered Pastor William Harris to an elderly parishioner beside him. The religious leader had paid a heavy price for his support of Robert, with his congregation now painfully divided. By session's end, everyone in the courthouse sensed the shifting ground beneath Cedar Hill's foundations. Decades of carefully maintained secrets were crumbling under the weight of simple truth. As Robert gathered his papers and prepared to leave, he caught Jennifer's gaze across the room, a look that acknowledged, perhaps for the first time, that neither of them would emerge from this unchanged. The courthouse victory had sent ripples through Cedar Hill, but for Robert Johnson, triumph came with unexpected costs. 3 days after the judge's ruling, he received a terse email from Westlake University. The neighboring institution had rescinded their invitation for him to deliver a keynote address on educational equality, an opportunity he had cherished for months. The message cited scheduling conflicts, but Robert understood the subtext. Controversy was bad for donations. At Jefferson High, where he had taught history for 11 years, the atmosphere had shifted perceptibly. Teachers who once lingered to chat by his classroom door now hurried past with quick nods. In the faculty lounge, conversations dimmed when he entered. The history teacher noticed how some colleagues averted their eyes in the hallway, their smiles tightening into polite grimaces before they found urgent reasons to be elsewhere. "It's like I've become radioactive," Robert confided to his sister one evening, his voice low as they sat on his porch. Angela squeezed his hand, her determination unwavering despite her brother's growing isolation. "They're scared," she replied. "Change always frightens people before it inspires them." The following week, Principal Matthews called Robert into his office. Though the administrator assured him his job wasn't in jeopardy, he suggested Robert might consider a lower profile until the situation blew over. The conversation left a bitter taste in his mouth. Yet despite these setbacks, Robert refused to let his spirit break. Instead of retreating, he channeled his energy into his classroom, creating a special after-school program for students interested in civic engagement. 8 teenagers, more than he had expected, showed up for the first meeting, their eyes bright with questions about justice and community responsibility. He found purpose in these small moments, explaining the mechanics of local government to curious 17-year-olds, helping them draft letters to city council members, watching them discover their own voices. When one shy student finally spoke up during a discussion about civic courage, Robert felt a warmth that counterbalanced the chill of professional isolation. Evenings found him supporting Angela's reform initiatives, reviewing petition language, and helping organize community forums. The siblings worked side by side at her kitchen table, sometimes joined by Sarah Martinez, whose documentary project was gaining momentum. Together they transformed personal pain into collective action. "You know they're hoping we'll just get tired and give up," Sarah remarked one night, reviewing footage on her laptop. Robert smiled, the weariness in his eyes balanced by quiet resolve. "Then they don't know Cedar Hill very well," he said, turning back to the stack of petitions before him. "And they certainly don't know us." The Cedar Hill courthouse fell silent as Commissioner David Davis took the stand. Once the embodiment of small-town authority with his tailored suits and commanding presence, he now appeared diminished, shoulders hunched beneath the weight of scrutiny. The commissioner's fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture that betrayed the crumbling facade of confidence he'd maintained throughout the proceedings. Robert Johnson sat motionless in the front row, his patient eyes never leaving the man whose family had orchestrated months of obstruction. Beside him, Angela squeezed her brother's hand, their shared strength palpable even in silence. "Commissioner Davis," the prosecutor began, methodically laying out evidence of tampered records and buried complaints. "Can you explain why your signature appears on directives to suppress legitimate grievances from Cedar Hill residents?" The courtroom held its collective breath. For weeks the community had watched this powerful man deflect and deny. But something had changed. Perhaps it was Sarah Martinez's documentary footage playing on local television, or the stack of recovered memos now entered into evidence. Whatever the cause, the commissioner's carefully constructed defenses were finally collapsing. "I was protecting our name," Davis finally admitted, his voice barely audible. The judge requested he speak up, and when he continued, decades of entitlement seemed to drain from his posture. "The Davis family has funded the hospital wing, the library renovation. My mother dedicated her life to this town." A murmur rippled through the spectators as he continued, each confession more damning than the last. He described how Jennifer's impulsive action at the gas station threatened to unravel years of carefully managed public perception. The family had weathered scandals before, but always behind closed doors, with cooperative officials and selective memory. "We've always handled things privately," he said, unable to meet the eyes of the townspeople he'd betrayed. When asked directly about the security footage, the commissioner's composure finally shattered. "Yes, I ordered it altered," he admitted. "I convinced myself it was protecting the community from division, but I was protecting myself." Pastor William Harris closed his eyes in prayer, while Michael Brown, the prosecutor, who had risked his career to pursue this case, straightened papers that needed no straightening, visibly processing the vindication of his difficult choice. As Davis stepped down from the witness stand, the implications of his testimony expanded beyond one incident at a gas station. His words had confirmed what many had long suspected. Cedar Hill's governance had served the powerful at the expense of justice. Robert remained still, his expression unreadable. This wasn't just his victory. It belonged to everyone who had refused to look away. For those paying close attention, the signs of Commissioner David Davis's involvement had always been there. During monthly council meetings, his eyes would drift to the polished oak table whenever citizens raised questions about transparency. His shoulders tensed visibly when Robert Johnson's name emerged in discussions. The commissioner's reluctance to release meeting minutes, always citing procedural reviews that mysteriously took weeks, had seemed merely bureaucratic until now. Sarah Martinez had noticed these patterns while filming town hall gatherings for her documentary. He would physically recoil when asked direct questions, she told Angela Johnson over coffee at Mary Thompson's diner, like someone anticipating a blow. The commissioner's anxious attempts to shield his family name from scrutiny extended beyond council chambers. He had redirected 3 separate community fundraisers away from topics that might spark discussion of accountability. When the local newspaper attempted to run a feature on Cedar Hill's history of civil rights, Davis had personally called the editor, suggesting a piece on the Davis family's charitable contributions instead. The pattern was clear. If you knew where to look, Michael Brown confessed to Robert during a chance encounter at the courthouse steps. The prosecutor's voice dropped to a whisper. Every time someone pushed too hard, resources disappeared. Budget cuts. Reassignment. I watched good people sidelined for asking questions. Cedar Hill operated on an unspoken rule that everyone understood. Power endured only when others looked away. The Davis family had maintained their influence not through outright threats, but through the subtle currency of favors, donations, and carefully cultivated relationships. Their name appeared on hospital wings and scholarship funds, generosity that bought silence as effectively as any threat. Pastor William Harris had recognized this dynamic years ago, but admitted his own complicity. I convinced myself that keeping peace was godly work, he told his congregation during a somber Wednesday service. But there is no peace without truth. Now, as evidence mounted against the commissioner, Cedar Hill's carefully maintained silence had been shattered. The truth-tellers, Robert with his quiet dignity, Sarah with her camera, Angela with her petitions, refused to be ignored any longer. Their voices, once dismissed as troublemakers, now echoed through every conversation at the diner, every checkout line at the grocery store, every pew at Sunday service. The town's awakening was painful but necessary. As residents revisited past incidents with fresh eyes, many recognized how they had participated in the system by looking away when confronted with uncomfortable truths. The conspiracy of silence that had protected the powerful was crumbling, one brave voice at a time. In the wake of the trial, Cedar Hill experienced a renaissance of civic engagement. Angela Johnson and Sarah Martinez, once strangers united by circumstance, found themselves at the forefront of a movement neither had anticipated leading. They established Cedar Hill for Dignity, a citizens' committee with a simple yet powerful mission to ensure accountability from those in power and reform the systems that had failed the community for generations. We're not just fighting one incident, Angela explained at their first meeting, held under the sprawling oak trees in the town square. We're addressing decades of looking the other way. Sarah, who had evolved from a part-time gas station employee to a passionate documentarian, brought her filmmaker's eye to their cause. Her camera captured the raw emotions of residents who'd never before felt safe enough to speak their truth. The young college student's quiet determination complemented Angela's fiery resolve, creating a leadership dynamic that resonated throughout Cedar Hill. Their open-air forums quickly became the heartbeat of the town's transformation. Every Thursday evening, folding chairs appeared in parks and community spaces, filled by people eager to reclaim their voices. The committee meticulously documented each testimony, creating a living archive of both historical grievances and visions for the future. My brother never wanted to be the face of this movement, Angela told a crowd one evening, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. But his courage showed us what standing firm looks like. What surprised many was how the movement particularly empowered women across Cedar Hill. Grandmothers who had witnessed decades of injustice sat beside young professionals and teenage activists, sharing strategies and support. Mary Thompson, who had once quietly placed justice flyers in her diner, now confidently moderated discussions about police reform and community oversight. Cedar Hill for Dignity created subcommittees focused on school board transparency, police accountability, and economic opportunity. They established a website documenting the Davis family's history of influence and the systemic issues it had enabled. When the town council attempted to dismiss their concerns as divisive, attendance at their forums only grew. Hope flickered in Cedar Hill, visible in the impromptu community gardens that sprang up in once neglected lots, in the new voter registration drives, and in the way neighbors now greeted each other with renewed recognition. Yet beneath this hopeful current ran an undercurrent of fear. Anonymous comments appeared on the committee's social media pages. Certain businesses quietly distanced themselves. Change never comes without resistance, Sarah reminded Angela, one evening as they packed up after a particularly successful forum. But look around, they can't silence all of us anymore. The two women watched as the diverse crowd dispersed into the warm Texas evening, carrying with them something Cedar Hill hadn't felt in years: possibility. The victory at the courthouse felt like a shallow triumph as Robert Johnson pulled another envelope from his mailbox. No return address, just like the others. Inside, crude cutouts from magazines formed a message that made his stomach tighten. Teachers should know when to keep quiet. He added it to the growing collection of threats he'd received since the trial. For the third night that week, the rumble of motorcycles disturbed the quiet street. Robert peered through his living room blinds at 4 men in leather jackets, their bikes parked directly across from his modest home. They made no move toward the house, but their message was clear: "We're watching you." "They're back again," he said into his phone, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm calling Michael," Angela replied, her protective instinct flaring. "The prosecutor needs to know this harassment continues." Robert sighed. "Michael Brown has his own problems. The threats against him were worse than mine." Sleep came fitfully that night, each distant engine sound jolting him awake. The history teacher, who once worried only about engaging students, now kept a baseball bat beside his bed and double-checked his locks obsessively. The next morning, Sarah Martinez arrived with coffee and determination. The young filmmaker had become a constant presence in his life, documenting not just his story, but the community's transformation. "I spoke with Pastor William yesterday," she said, setting her camera bag down. "The church is organizing a neighborhood watch. People will take shifts driving by your house." Robert's eyes moistened. "They shouldn't have to risk themselves." "That's exactly what you did for all of us," Sarah countered. "You stood up when it would have been easier to stay down." By afternoon, the support materialized in unexpected ways. Mary from the local diner delivered a homemade casserole. 3 of Robert's students washed his car, refusing to leave until they were sure he was safe. Even James Carter, the reporter whose expose had rocked Cedar Hill, drove by twice to check on him. When night fell again, the motorcycles returned. But this time, they found the street lined with parked cars, members of Cedar Hill Baptist Church, sitting vigil, reading books by dashboard lights. The bikers circled once, then disappeared. Later, as Robert graded papers at his kitchen table, he noticed something had changed within himself. The fear remained, but it no longer consumed him. Each threat had only deepened his resolve, each act of intimidation strengthened by the community that now stood with him. Cedar Hill was fighting back, not just for him but for themselves. And in that knowledge, Robert found a shield stronger than any lock or weapon: the armor of solidarity. As the months passed, Cedar Hill transformed before everyone's eyes. The Magnolia Diner, where Mary Thompson had served coffee for 20 years, now offered free meals every Tuesday to volunteers working with Cedar Hill for Dignity. Robert Johnson found himself moved to tears the first time he walked in and saw a handwritten sign, "Teachers Eat Free, Standing for Truth." Local businesses that had initially stayed neutral began displaying small symbols of solidarity in their windows, blue ribbons that matched the color of Robert's sedan from that fateful day. Even Mr. Peterson, the notoriously cranky hardware store owner, had allowed teenagers to paint a mural on his side wall depicting clasped hands of different colors. "I never thought I'd see this town change like this," Angela Johnson told her brother as they walked down Main Street one evening, passing the courthouse where protest art now adorned the public square. Chalk messages of hope and justice washed away with each rain, but reappeared stronger the next day. The Baptist Church, once divided over Pastor William Harris's stance, had become a central meeting place. The pastor opened the fellowship hall 3 nights a week for strategy sessions, his deep voice carrying through prayers that now explicitly mentioned courage in the face of injustice. Sarah Martinez's documentary had screened at the local high school, drawing a crowd that spilled into the parking lot. Her camera captured the evolution of a town finding its voice after decades of silence. Yet beneath this visible transformation, darker currents flowed. Robert received a phone call late one night from Michael Brown, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're meeting at the country club after hours," the prosecutor said. "Davis and his people, planning something. Be careful." Whispers of backroom deals reached Angela through a school secretary who'd overheard board members discussing ways to restore order. The old guard, families who'd controlled Cedar Hill for generations, weren't surrendering power without a fight. Commissioner David Davis, though publicly disgraced, still commanded loyalty from business owners who feared change. Anonymous letters appeared in mailboxes along Oak Street, warning of outside agitators and threats to property values. At the diner, Robert overheard two men in suits discussing how this whole mess could be cleaned up before tourist season. They fell silent when they noticed him, offering tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. "We've changed the surface," Sarah told Angela during a planning meeting, "but the roots run deep." Angela nodded, watching volunteers map out their next community forum. "Then we dig deeper," she replied, her determination unwavering. Cedar Hill's struggle was only beginning, but for the first time in memory, its people were awake. James Carter, a seasoned reporter for the Cedar Hill Chronicle, had been digging through public records for weeks. What began as research into Robert Johnson's case had led him down a rabbit hole of suspicious transactions and missing paperwork. Late one night, surrounded by stacks of documents in his cramped apartment, he found it: the smoking gun. The next morning's headline sent shockwaves through town: "Corruption Exposed, Davis Family's Decades of Influence." The front page detailed how Commissioner David Davis had directed public contracts worth millions to companies owned by family friends. Campaign donations had mysteriously vanished from official records, only to reappear as renovations on Davis family properties. The trail of bribes stretched back nearly 20 years. "This was never just about what happened at that gas station," Robert told Angela over coffee at Mary Thompson's diner. His sister nodded solemnly, watching as patrons around them pored over copies of the newspaper, their expressions shifting from shock to anger. Sarah Martinez was among the first to arrive at the emergency city council meeting called that evening. The young filmmaker positioned her camera at the back of the packed town hall, capturing the unprecedented scene. Citizens who had never attended a public meeting stood shoulder to shoulder, demanding answers. Commissioner Davis sat ashen-faced at the council table, avoiding eye contact with the crowd. When he finally spoke, his voice wavered. "I maintain that certain arrangements were made for the benefit of Cedar Hill's development," he claimed, but the excuse fell flat against the detailed evidence. Michael Brown, the prosecutor who had once feared for his career, now stood with newfound resolve. "The investigation will expand to include all allegations outlined in Mr. Carter's reporting," he announced, earning thunderous applause. Pastor William Harris moved through the crowd, offering quiet words of support to those most shaken by the revelation. "The truth may hurt," he told an elderly parishioner, "but healing can't begin without it." Outside Town Hall, Jennifer Davis slipped away from reporters, her face hidden behind large sunglasses. The slap that had once seemed an isolated incident now appeared as merely one symptom of a system built on privilege and protection. For Robert, watching from the back row, the vindication was bittersweet. His personal ordeal had uncovered something far larger than himself, a corrupt foundation upon which Cedar Hill had unknowingly built its community. As the meeting adjourned, Sarah approached him with her camera. "Would you like to say something for the documentary?" she asked. Robert paused, considering his words carefully. "This was never about one slap," he finally said. "It was about who gets heard in Cedar Hill and who doesn't." Throughout the ordeal, Robert Johnson's life had transformed in ways he could never have anticipated. The history teacher who once enjoyed quiet afternoons grading papers now jolted awake at 3 in the morning, his mind racing with legal strategies and community concerns. The gentle smile that had welcomed students for years now appeared less frequently, replaced by deep lines of exhaustion that aged him well beyond his years. "I never wanted to be the face of anything," Robert confessed to his sister during one of their late-night talks on his porch. Angela squeezed his hand, understanding the weight he carried. His modest home, once a sanctuary, had become both headquarters and fortress. The walls were covered with schedules, meeting notes, and encouraging cards from supporters. Outside, a security camera installed after the third threatening letter kept silent watch. At school, Robert noticed the divide among his colleagues. Some embraced him with newfound respect, while others maintained a careful distance, afraid of being pulled into the controversy. His classroom, however, remained his refuge. There, discussing historical movements for justice, he found purpose in connecting past struggles to present challenges. "Mr. Johnson, do you regret standing up for yourself?" a student asked during a particularly difficult week. Robert paused, considering the toll, the sleepless nights, the strain on his health, the constant scrutiny. He thought about the motorcycle gangs that occasionally rumbled past his house at midnight, a reminder that powerful people still wanted him silenced. "No," he finally answered. "Some burdens are worth carrying." What sustained him were the unexpected moments of solidarity. Sarah Martinez sharing footage from her documentary that showed elderly residents thanking him for his courage, Pastor Williams' weekly calls offering prayers and practical support, even Michael Brown, the prosecutor, who had initially hesitated, now nodding respectfully when they passed in town. Each tearful letter from his parents, who worried constantly about his safety, reminded Robert of what was at stake. "Your grandfather faced worse and never bent," his father had written. Cedar Hill needs to learn its lesson. The transformation was most evident in how Robert carried himself. The reluctant symbol now spoke with quiet authority at town meetings. His voice, strengthened by necessity, carried further than he ever imagined possible. Sometimes, Angela told the Cedar Hill for Dignity Committee, the person who changes everything is the one who never wanted the spotlight in the first place. Robert Johnson never asked to be a catalyst, but in defending his dignity that summer day at the gas station, he had become exactly that, a reluctant hero whose personal sacrifice was slowly reshaping the soul of Cedar Hill. As the first anniversary of the gas station incident approached, Cedar Hill transformed. The town square, once merely a place people passed through, became sacred ground as residents gathered for a candlelight vigil. Robert Johnson stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, his gentle smile tinged with the weariness that had become part of him over the past year. The evening air carried the scent of magnolia blossoms, their white petals catching the golden light of hundreds of flames. Angela Johnson stood beside her brother, her hand occasionally squeezing his in silent support. She had organized this gathering not as a celebration, but as acknowledgement, a community reckoning with its past. "1 year ago we were strangers living side by side," Pastor William Harris addressed the crowd, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "Today we stand together, having faced difficult truths about our town." Sarah Martinez moved through the crowd with her camera, documenting this moment for her film. The young college student had transformed too, from a nervous witness to a confident chronicler of Cedar Hill's journey. Her documentary had already been accepted at 3 regional film festivals. Commissioner David Davis stood at the back, his presence unexpected but significant. The man who had once orchestrated cover-ups now attended as part of his personal atonement. His family name, once synonymous with power, now carried the weight of accountability. Michael Brown watched from nearby, the prosecutor's face reflecting both relief and lingering concern. The threats had subsided, but the memory of those tense months remained fresh in his mind. The cracked asphalt of the gas station parking lot, now visible in the distance, seemed unremarkable, just a patch of concrete where people filled their vehicles. Yet everyone present knew its significance, how a single moment there had cracked open decades of silence. "We don't pretend the healing is complete," Angela said, addressing the gathering. "But we face tomorrow together, with open eyes." Residents held their candles higher as she spoke, the light reflecting in teary eyes. Some who had once turned away from Robert now stood beside him. Others who had defended Jennifer Davis had come to recognize the larger truths her actions had inadvertently exposed. The smell of coffee wafted from the diner across the street, where Mary Thompson had set up a table offering free cups to anyone who needed warmth. The porcelain mugs, not paper cups, represented something important. This wasn't a temporary gathering but a community rebuilding itself. As the vigil concluded, Robert finally spoke. "The past cannot be undone," he said simply, "but the future is ours to shape together." The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows across faces both familiar and newly known. Cedar Hill had been broken open, but in that breaking something stronger had begun to form. Robert Johnson never asked to be a hero. Standing in his classroom, gazing at the faces of students who now looked at him differently, some with newfound respect, others with uncertainty, he often wondered how a single moment at a gas station had altered the course of so many lives. "Mr. Johnson, will you tell us about what happened?" The student would occasionally ask, and Robert would smile gently and redirect the conversation back to history lessons, knowing his own story had already become part of Cedar Hill's living history. The town had changed. Where once stood a monolith of power and silence, cracks had formed, allowing light to penetrate decades of darkness. The Davis family's influence had diminished, though not disappeared entirely. Commissioner David Davis had resigned, his public confession opening doors that many thought would remain forever sealed. At the diner where Mary Thompson still poured coffee each morning, conversations flowed more freely now. People spoke truths they'd once swallowed with their breakfast. The security camera footage that captured that fateful slap had become more than evidence. It was a symbol of what happens when someone refuses to accept injustice as normal. "You never set out to change things," Angela told her brother one evening as they sat on his porch, watching fireflies dance against the Texas twilight. "But sometimes standing your ground is all it takes." Sarah Martinez's documentary had won regional awards, bringing Cedar Hill's transformation to wider attention. Her camera had captured not just corruption, but healing, the painful, imperfect process of a community facing its demons. Not everything had been resolved. Jennifer Davis had left town, unwilling to face the consequences of her actions or her family's legacy. Some residents still crossed the street when they saw Robert coming, uncomfortable with what his presence represented. Pastor Williams' congregation had shrunk, then slowly grown again, with new members drawn to his message of authentic reconciliation. The church that once sang Christmas hymns with Robert now sang anthems of justice and restoration. Cedar Hill for Dignity continued its work, tackling issues beyond the initial incident: housing discrimination, police reform, school funding inequities. What began with a slap had revealed the deeper wounds beneath the town's surface. Robert still received occasional threats, though they came less frequently now. Each one reminded him of the price of standing firm. Each victory, however small, reminded him why it mattered. As Cedar Hill rebuilt itself, not perfectly, not completely, but honestly, the question lingered in every heart, whispered in quiet conversations and debated in public forums: how far would you go to defend your truth? For Robert Johnson, the answer had changed everything.